This is the Open University.
Welcome to the only vlog that doesn't call you guys and doesn't have a sort of generic YouTube library music mandolin or techno, even worse, backing. Which is not to say that it's completely original. I don't know what that would mean. It would probably mean that you couldn't understand a thing I was saying. This is totally coming out of a predictable aesthetic. It's a video essay. Essays go back to Addison and Lamb and all sorts of people, and people like Brian Dillon today are writing books about the essay. It's a kind of trendy form. Not just the content, but the style is in the manner of broadcast. Ghostbox label, Richard Littler's Scarfolk project, or Simon Reynolds' Retromania. There's this sense of deliberate spookiness and hauntology. Somebody commented recently that the generic music needed to be ironed. It's ironic, of course. It's the Brian Cant song about clay that I used last time, for instance. It's quite a familiar ground. It was in a podcast by members of Broadcast, the group Broadcast. So I'm not outside culture, and sometimes I get a strong impression of being inside culture, inside cultural trends. And I was perusing the Financial Times this morning, and I read this article, which was actually by someone called Tom Robbins, but was drawing on an idea, a concept by Kyle Chaika. If you image Google him, he's a guy based in Brooklyn who looks about 12 years old. He looks very young. And he's come up with this term AirSpace, which I guess refers to Airbnb, a sort of generic Airbnb look which is developing and which has become a new conformity and which flattens the world in the sense that if you travel and stay within a certain kind of place, you're going to always experience this. And I was talking a bit with Liana in Kuala Lumpur when I was there about this, because we were talking about those hand-drawn fonts which everybody uses, or sort of hand-drawn sans serif with drop shadow, a certain kind of look which you often see. There are obviously regional variations, like in Seoul, Airbnbs, you often get Union Jacks, bizarrely enough. There's a sort of trend at the moment for often black and white or grayscale Union Jacks. What you see in my pictures is my sensibility, which is a bit different. I'm not particularly an airspace type of person, but I did feel like these articles about millennials and their sort of blanding of the world through the interface between the digital and the physical world did hit several targets that felt quite close to home. So I've bolded some of the trends that are name-checked here in the Financial Times piece. So they're sort of saying that because of travelers are using things like Pinterest, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr. And I have noticed the penetration, first of all, of things like Airbnb into interiors of buildings and how they've completely transformed in the same way that the car and the telephone transformed in the 20th century the outsides of streets, or electricity completely transformed the look of an apartment, when you could turn the lights on. But also you could bring in things like television and radio, and that, again, made a room a completely different proposition to what it used to be in the 19th century. So things which are structuring our interiors and exteriors now are these social media platforms. Some people may be abandoning Facebook, but it's still the only game in town. But also I noticed that Instagram basically affecting the way people behave almost as radically as when Pokemon Go was introduced, and I would see my street in Osaka suddenly fill up with Chinese tourists who are all hunting exotic monsters glued to their cell phones. And the police would actually come along the street with loudhailers saying, "Please do not stop your cars here, please do not accumulate here." And they've now got signs up in some of the local temples and things saying it's forbidden to use Pokemon Go, to chase these monsters, because of course the religion itself was a spiritual version of Pokemon Go, in that you were supposed to imagine gods lurking in these holy places like temples and shrines rather than Pokemon monsters. But just the very fabric of cities is transforming, and having just come in from this tour of 5 different cities in Southeast Asia, got very conscious of the rapid transformation of places like Myanmar. Myanmar is actually mentioned in the Times article, which was drawing on a Guardian piece, which itself was drawing on a piece that Chaika had written in The Verge, a Brooklyn free paper, I think it is, in 2016. Much longer piece, more in-depth piece. And he mentions that Myanmar has become one of the sort of off the beaten track destinations, along with North Korea and places like that. But actually, one of the amusing things for me about being in Myanmar this year was that I was essentially seeking out locations like a cafe run by a German, this cafe called Paris Boga, which I mentioned several times. Places which could be anywhere. I mean, that's a cafe which made a certain kind of coffee that you would find in Berlin, in Agora, or whichever cafe you like to go to in Berlin, or the same kind of coffee I drank today. I had a latte macchiato overlooking the Meguro River in Tokyo, my $4 espresso, and of course it was an experience enhanced by fast Wi-Fi provided by the cafe. So there is this leveling. Aperol Spritz gets a mention in this piece. It's something I was drinking in about 2015 quite a lot because of encountering it in Venice, that particular hour of the day when the church bells start ringing and everyone goes to their local bar and has an Aperol Spritz. Me and Hani, my friend Hani, who was in Venice with me that year, came back to Berlin and we started ordering Aperol Spritzes wherever we went, and we were not the only ones. That people are talking about this being a kind of leveling effect, but you could say this is nothing new. Someone like Alexander the Great spread Grecian values and culture through to Asia, and then brought Asian values back to Europe. So there's always been this flattening effect. There becomes more like here, and here becomes more like there. Essentially, that is an inevitable result of travel and exchange, cultural exchange. So people complaining about the spread of a so-called hipster aesthetic, or AirSpace. AirSpace obviously owes something to Rem Koolhaas's concept of junk space. The idea, which actually goes back, I think, to Gertrude Stein when she talked about Oakland in California and said, "There's no there there. There is no there there. There is nothing essentially." Here we come to this kind of idea of the somewheres and the anywheres. This David Goodhart book we were talking about last year in these talks, where there's a kind of a putting down, a derogation of the idea of placeless or the international or the universal. Something I was thinking about recently actually is that when you're young, you're kind of interchangeable and universal, universally valid in that you're sexy when you're young. And then as you get older, you sort of get more like yourself. You develop your own taste and you become grotesque rather than universal. So a lifetime is this progression from the universal to the grotesque. And in a way, being grotesque is having a lot of different decades and different style bandwagons to draw from, having been in all those different places. And maybe you picked up more from the 70s than the 80s. I noticed one of the things I'm photographing is 70s type colours. I actually had a conversation today with a guy in Nakameguro, a butcher, a chicken butcher, who spoke very good English. I was raising my iPhone to photograph the outside of his shop, which had some nice old 70s style logos, sort of chickens. And he said no photos in a stern voice, but then it turned out he was joking and he was actually very friendly. And I said to him, I just like the 70s style sticker. He was telling me that this is a cockerel, but he totally understood where I was coming from, that this was the kind of thing people, Instagram, people raise their phones to his old ripped up stickers, and he's kept them. He was a young guy, but he could appreciate this kind of retro style. So when these journalists are trying to define AirSpace as a style, they're talking about a combination of sort of minimalist post-industrial style, polished concrete, raw wood, kind of artisanal style, but also mid-century modern furniture, so a kind of Scandinavian aesthetic, which they also connect with IKEA. I had a bit of IKEA lust today, actually. I was looking for the new Bluetooth speaker they're doing called the NB 30 and 60. There's two different models. One of them's quite large, the other's a bit smaller, and they have this fabric cover and very simple, minimal design. Apparently, audio is not great, especially when you're streaming it with Bluetooth. If you do a direct connection, it's better. But it's cheap, and it looks good, and it looks like a kind of fun, cool thing to slightly change your relationship with music, your experience of music. I don't really have any problems with IKEA, and actually it was one of it was the very first thing I did when I arrived in Kuala Lumpur, was to go to IKEA there, to sort of relive the sameness and the difference of the one that I know so well, which was near my house in Osaka. Because I'd been in Myanmar, in this city which had nothing like an IKEA. It might only be a matter of time, though. There might well be an IKEA eventually in in Yangon. You might say, heaven forbid. I mean, but I was kind of enjoying being at the cusp of that change when there are generic places suddenly cropping up. The German who ran the cafe I used to go to there was saying that Myanmar is a still undiscovered country, but that status is really changing quickly. And in a couple of years, the speed at which it has changed just in the last 2 years, getting Wi-Fi, getting ATMs, is going to affect other things too. And there'll probably be a lot more Airbnbs and things like that in Yangon. Meanwhile, cities like Paris and London and Tokyo, maybe to a lesser extent Tokyo and New York, are all generically converging. It is really a concern people have about this convergence. Craft beer, all the sort of the other things that kind of hit home. The question is, how should we travel then if you're trying to avoid the paradox of just coming across the same old things everywhere you go? So you have to go to more far-flung places like North Korea, like Myanmar, or else you kind of have boredom tourism where you have a sort of cabin in the woods, minimal but stylish. You stare at the trees, you muse on mindfulness, and you catch up on your reading. Again, of course, I'm very much catching up on my reading. Post-Malaysia, rereading the Joseph Conrad book Victory, which is set in Malaysia, or rather reading the second half of that. The other thing you can do is turn the camera on yourself. I remember once I was touring with Toog, and he said he had a Super 8 camera, and he said, what should I film on this tour? I want to do something quite limited and pungent, which is not just a travel documentary. And I said, well, why don't you, wherever you go, just film your hand? That's what he literally did. He held up his hand and filmed it. And that's the sort of reductio ad absurdum of the idea of making a boring and generic film, which... But then again, once said something very interesting. He said he sometimes goes to other countries, like he went to Venice, and he didn't leave the courtyard of the building he was staying in. He just listened to the sounds, the ambient sounds of Venice penetrating into his courtyard. And that was enough for him to sort of maybe construct in his mind some amazing Venice outside. So you can turn inwards, or you could turn the camera around and take selfies, or your hand, just your hand, as Gilles did. But the Financial Times piece ends with this idea that actually, if you go outside the cities, you're going to find difference. You're going to find places that haven't changed much in centuries. I think that's probably true. But I also think that Japan is still significantly more different culturally. There's some cultural weirdness here, which is why I keep coming back. I keep finding that although it has all these structural similarities to Western cities, there is some essential strangeness here. It's essentially a rich civilization. It's never been colonized. It's an advanced civilization, which is the intense hygiene, for instance, or the intense harmony. These things, they seem qualitatively different from what I've experienced elsewhere. The idea, which has been occurring to me also myself, about abandoning permanent houses for digital nomadism, I don't particularly like that term, digital nomadism, but it is really an offshoot of the appification, if you like, of our lives, that we no longer think about needing cars, landline telephones, houses. People with cars tended to range around a particular kind of circumference of local trips to shops and businesses and home and work. But people who use a combination of bicycles and airplanes, or even pedestrians. I'm a radical pedestrian in the sense that I think the future is human beings walking around using their own bodies again. People will come back to that. So what makes sense for me is a plane arriving in a new country and then me getting as rapidly as possible to the center of the city that airport is in or connected to, and then walking around with my feet, always breaking in a new pair of shoes and getting blisters, the usual problems of being a pedestrian. The main problem, though, is having to deal with motorized traffic, which seems to be an anomaly and an anachronism, and needs to be kicked out of cities as soon as possible. But I think there's a lot to be said for placelessness as a virtue, as something sort of young and sexy, perhaps millennially sexy, in the sense of character being grotesqueness. That when a place gets character, it's actually simply the residue of all its bad habits over the centuries. It's kind of nothing to boast about. Sure, you can dress it up in folk costumes and make it look colourful and exotic, photographable, Instagrammable, whatever, but essentially we shouldn't do down the universal and the vapid in a sense. There's something quite nice about what's universal and vapid and flavourless, because flavour in itself might be something slightly disgusting.
Open University.